Okay, I need to preface my message. I told you I would not offer an opinion on what's happening in the Middle East right now. And I'm not going to offer you an opinion. I'm going to lay out some pieces of information that actually start with where we have been for the last many weeks. That is, traditions that make void the Word of God, the conflation and confusion of things within the church. Now this particular message will probably let me segue into something else. But I want to make this abundantly clear because unfortunately there are so many people who will hear sound bites and not understand where I'm coming from. So I'm just going to tell you straight up front. I think there is so much ignorance within academia of religious studies. Okay? So my bigger issue here is incredible frustration because no matter how many times I've covered this subject regarding Israelites, Hebrews, Jews, everywhere I turn, I feel terrible for the average layperson who doesn't have my knowledge or expertise. You go on the internet and you start looking up the origins of Judaism. Let me read a few things to you, and I'm only going to read a verse or a line or two, so I don't even feel compelled to say anything more than what I'm going to read to you makes the point. One source here says the origins of Judaism date back more than 3,500 years. This person, or this writer, didn't take the time to explain that, and to somebody like me, that's nonsense. It's just utter nonsense, and I'm going to explain to you why. This person also says what is considered classical or rabbinic Judaism did not emerge until the 1st century AD, and they're right. Rabbinic Judaism is a new thing, and I say new as in an established formula or structure that started after the fall of the temple and the expulsion of the Jews in 70 AD. But then you move on to things like this. Here's an article about Abraham. The subject of Abraham, who became the first Hebrew. Why do I have an issue with that? I'll tell you why. Here we go. Just hold on. Now, I knew I would get all of my stuff kind of messed up here. So I have it's in my handwriting, so don't hate me for this, okay? I try, but it's sometimes really hard. So I did and there's some mistakes on here, so I'm just showing you briefly. This would be Adam, Cain, Abel, Seth, right, and the descendants. And if you follow the descendants that go through the line of Seth down to Noah through Shem, sorry for this, but the paper wasn't big enough. You come down Shem, Eber, which is where we get our word for Hebrew, and Abraham is down here, Abram, so he can't be the first Hebrew. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes. You read things, and somebody who doesn't know will go, oh, yeah, it makes sense to me. But I read this, and I get outraged. Wait, I'm not done. Don't go anywhere. Okay, here's one. Judaism timeline. I'm hoping I don't have to comment on this for my audience. I'm hoping. Read the first top line there to yourselves, highlighted. Okay, so for you at home, if you maybe are a newer listener, I'll explain this. Moses led the Jews on an exodus from Egypt. That is so problematic for me that anyone would write that. Because there were Hebrew people. I'm going to explain all this today. There were Hebrew people, but there were no Jews. Do not get mad at me. Do not get angry. I'm asking you today to listen to me and then go and do some homework. And you'll find out that the things that we just take for granted, maybe we need to take a second look, because a lot of this foundational information will help us to sort out some things going on today. What's the next one say? Down here, Timeline is off, by the way. 1700 BC didn't happen at that time. By the way, this didn't happen in 1280 BC either. Okay, sorry, the timelines are not right. Timeline is not right. First covenant with God. Abraham circumcised himself. Sorry, whoever did this is a complete moron and doesn't read the Bible. The first covenant was to Noah. And the difference between Noah and Abraham in terms of covenant, God, when he covenanted with Noah, there was nothing that the man had to do to himself or to his offspring. He came out of the ark, he built an altar, he offered sacrifices. God made a covenant with him by giving him the rainbow in the sky and saying, I will not flood the earth again in this manner. That's the first covenant right there. And if you really, really want to get totally technical, we could take the first covenant back to the garden, which was broken, but that's a story for another day, and that's open to discussion. This one is not. The first covenant from God to man was Noah, but nothing affecting the man himself. So essentially, because God flooded the earth, or a part of the earth, whatever you believe, whether the flood was local or global, it doesn't matter for this conversation. The covenant was essentially with Noah, but for the ground, the earth, the people, and then go out and replenish, repopulate, his instructions. Abraham's covenant, a little bit different. Now it's going to cost a little bit. It's going to cost some skin of the human being. That will become the covenant. So when I read these things, it just makes my blood boil that someone would produce this, put this out, and an average, forgive me for saying it, I'm not meaning this to be insulting, but an average person who doesn't have the education and the time put in, reads this and says, oh, wow, and takes that as fact. And you walk around with that thinking that's what it is, but it's not. The last one just really, the timeline is off again. What does that say? Beginning of Judaism. Abraham was born according to the Torah and the Old Testament. God chose Abraham to be the father of Isaac, the founder of the Jewish people. So, literally, I want to tell you, I combed, and I was looking for a deliberate number. I went to 100 websites, painstaking, and I saw things ranging from Judaism began 5,000 years ago based on the fact that the Jewish calendar reads the year 5,700 or whatever it is. The Jewish people existed 4,000 years ago. Jewish people are a pure race. Another frustration is archaeology has determined timelines for us. Neolithic period or Bronze Age period that fits into a timeline that lets us, if we're going to go with archaeology, look at the territory, investigate the peoples, the settlements. So was there a settlement, for example? Were there people living in the land that we call Israel today? Were there people living there 3,500 or 4,000 years ago? Absolutely. And this poses this problem that continuously, if we're not setting the record straight, we have a lot of confusion going on. Now, I hope you follow my train of thought, because we're going to be trying to peel back some nomenclature, some understanding of terminologies that are loosely tossed around. That's number one. Number two, we're actually going to try, and I don't think I'm going to do it in one message, okay? We're going to try and figure out the identity of certain peoples that have a right to claim they are Jewish. And I'm not saying that anybody can't claim that, but I'm talking about when we get into parsing things, it's important that we have proper terminology so we're not left with all of this, what I call garbage, that people just kind of mull around. They say stuff without saying anything. It's kind of like RVP. A yellow school bus. All right. Don't you love a yellow school bus? We all love yellow school buses. And what are we talking about? I have no idea. All right. So how did these people become known as Jewish? How did Judaism evolve? These are all important Because when we start getting into the nuts and bolts of this, you're going to find that the history is not as cut and dry as most people think. And there are reasons why God did certain things. They make perfect sense if you will let the story unfold. This is not a teaching for people who just want a quick 1-second answer. If you're looking for that, tune me off, go away somewhere. This requires some heavy explanation, and I'm going to do just that today. So, we're going to start with a bit of terminology. So the first word I want to start with is Semite. And most of you know I like to use a site called Etymology Online. Until this. And I'll explain this too. So let me start first with terminology. So I'm going to put this up for you so you can see a little bit. I'm sorry, forgive my handwriting. Semite dates from 1847 AD, which describes a Jew, an Arab, Assyrian, or Aramean, and I could put etc. because there's a reason for this. An isolated use from 1797 AD refers to the Semitic language, from Semitic, Latin Semita, Greek Shem, which is Shem, one of Noah's sons. So when we talk about Semitic peoples, Semitic language, we are talking about all the descendants of Shem going down and following this line. But if you really want to be technical, all the people descending in this line are also Semitic, and Semitic as an adjective, 1797, denoting the major language groups that include Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Assyrian, etc. The term anti-Semitism was coined in 1879, and that's rather late. If we're talking about history, we're in the year 2023, 1897, 1879 may seem like a long time ago, but in terms of history, that's quite recent. By William Marr, to designate anti-Jewish campaigns underway in Central Europe at the time. And I put that in there. It was usurping the rest of the Semitic category. How can you, again, talk to anybody today, and when they say anti-Semitism, immediately it only refers to the Jew. But if you're looking in this woodpile, if you're looking in the genealogies of this book, sorry, it includes our Arab brothers and sisters. You can't just take a term and take it for yourself, but that's what's happened now. The common tongue of people today, anti-Semitism, is being anti-Jewish. But I'm sorry to tell you that's not the definition. And you could say, but you're the only person saying that. Well, then I will be. I'm not going to use the word in any other way. And when I say something used in a modern term, I'll refer to it in a modern way, how it's colloquially used, but that is not the proper definition. You might say, okay, well, what else do you have for me? Well, let's look at this one. This one I know I'm going to make a lot of friends with. Judaism, attested to since 1400 AD in Anglo-Latin. The word comes into English from the Greek Judaismos, from Judeos, Jew, earlier Juhedi or Judahid, literally connoting Jewhood. Jew as a noun was spelt in different spellings before the J came into our language stream. From the French, juif, Greek, Judeos, from Aramaic, Yehudahe, Hebrew, and I did this is just for phonetics, Yehudi. So you can see from Yehuda, that is Judah, and Judah is Jacob/Israel, his fourth son. Okay? So when we talk about the tribe of Judah and Judahites, do not get confused with this, that the people we are referring to, and I'm going to show you a big glaring problem we all have here, is in understanding what exactly that meant at the time. Will you do me a favor and open your Bibles to 2 Kings 16, and I'm going to show you something. 2 Kings 16 begins in the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Ramaliah. Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. You see the word Judah, right? Read down in verse 6. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath to Syria and drave the Jews from Elath. And the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there unto this day. Why am I showing you this? I want you to look at this word, Judah, right there. Then we're going to go down, we're going to look at where the King James translators translated Jews. The Hebrew reads pretty clear, Judah, in verse 1, and the Judahites, those inhabitants of Judah, not Jewish people. Do you understand the difference? The men of Judah, the Judahites, and even the NIV. Read what the NIV says here. At that time, Rezin, king of Aram, blah, 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 driving out the men of Judah. The Judahites were driven out of Elath during this period, but it does not say the Jews were. So I want to make sure before I go forward, is that clear? Yes. Now, the reason why I do this is because the difficulty we are going to encounter. The word Jew, Jewish, comes from Judahite, from Yehuda, from Judah. But the question that has to be asked, which I don't see anyone asking this, when did Judaism actually start? And you can't do what all these other websites do and say, well, God covenanted with Abraham, therefore, that is stupid. Now let me give you a little bit of background. God calls Abram out of Ur of Chaldees. He came from a very sophisticated, don't fool yourself. If you are interested, please read the writing of Woolley. He was the one who excavated Ur. And his writing is mind-boggling to describe a civilization that was so far advanced, its structure, its kingships, everything that it had. So don't think that Abram's coming out of Ur of Chaldees is some, I don't know nothing. But they worshipped, it says clearly, Terah worshipped foreign gods, other gods, which means usually that's passed on from father to son and through the family. So make no mistake, we're only reading what we are given to read. Make no mistake, you don't come out of a land that is full of idol worship. And even though God spoke to him, it doesn't mean that he abandoned all of his idols either. In fact, here is my big problem. All of these people wanting to tell you how far Judaism goes back. Now I'm going to ask you a question, which is based on this. We can say that through Abraham, who gave, obviously we know Abraham had 2 children. One was the promised one, Isaac. The other one was the works of the flesh with Hagar, Ishmael. That line produces Jacob, for which God will change his name to Israel. Jacob, from the name means heel catcher, to Israel, either a prince that has power with God or one who is governed by God. There's a lot of minutiae in there. But the big problem is when people say, anything here is Jewish. And let me explain. I wrestled when I was teaching through the tabernacle. I said God had prescribed things in the wilderness after Moses brought the children of Israel out of Egypt's bondage, that God had given the law and prescriptions to abide by. Now, here is the error. Just because God spoke to Noah, just because God spoke to Abraham, just because God spoke to Isaac or spoke to Jacob, does not establish a religion. A religion, if we're going to look at it in proper context, yes, it does start with a relationship, but it also starts with recognizing, practicing, adhering, worship. So by the time we get to Jacob, do you remember when Jacob put his head down on the rock and he said, God was in this place, surely, and I knew it not? Don't think for a minute that even there, that makes that person a Jew. Many people who are Christians come to a moment of, oh my gosh, does that make them a Christian immediately? I don't think so. You've got to come to know who God is, what he wants of you, what he says. There's a whole lot more than just God talking to somebody. But this is how this has been morphed, because God spoke to these people. You might as well go back to the garden and say, well, God spoke to Adam and Eve, therefore they must be Jewish too, and God must be Jewish. And I'm not being funny either. So we have a big problem. So let's talk about why. The first thing we know, and I'm going to try and explain this in a proper sequence. Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob is chosen because the promise was given way back there that in Abraham, in his seed, in his line, many nations. Okay? It's Jacob that will bring that to fulfillment. First, God changes his name to Israel, from heel catcher to God governed. Second, he begins to have children amongst the 4 women, their 2 wives, which is a whole different story, and their handmaids, produce 12 children. This is probably the shortest way to tell the story. They are called the children of, they're not called the children of Jacob anymore, they're called the children of Israel. They are his children. Those children have children and so on. Collectively, they become known as the children of Israel. That means from the first generation all the way down, as long as they kept perpetuating, they were the children of Israel. Okay? Now, what you have becomes very interesting. These people, as they are repopulating at a really crazy rate and having children, there was a famine in the land where they were living. They all go to Egypt. And part of this story is that Joseph, who was one of the children of Israel, he was sold into bondage by his brothers, sold off, good riddance, because he was the father's favorite. It is Joseph who basically rises from being in a prison cell to second in command in Egypt, because he saves Egypt during a famine time by interpreting a dream, that his family goes to where the food is. Otherwise, they would have died. So the whole tribe, all the children of Israel, go to live in the land of Goshen, and they are prosperous, and they're living their best life. Until the scripture says, Joseph died, and there rose up a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And that Pharaoh kind of freaked out at the massive amount of how they repopulated and their wealth and their cattle. So he basically says, these people are going to be put in bondage. And don't think that he's acting autonomously, because God told Abraham way back there in Genesis 12, your seed is going to go into a land where they're strangers. They'll be there. Genesis 12 says for 430 years. They'll come out in the 4th generation, richer, and I will lead them into a land. And this begins this kind of unfolding of a controversy that will lead them into a land, essentially, that God promises then. He says, your descendants, Abraham, will be as the stars of the sky and as the sand of the sea, and land is promised. Now, these folks, while they were in Goshen, before they were in Egypt's bondage, they were not Jews. They were Hebrews. And we don't exactly know what they would have practiced, but I want you to imagine something. Going from farmers, agricultural people, agrarian society, now in bondage, and let's just say, because there's a lot of debate of how long they were there, but let's just say they were there for a couple hundred years. Let's say they were only there for 300 years. Even though the Bible says 430, that may not be counting all the time they were enslaved. Tell me that your culture, whatever culture it is going to remain solid. It will not. Because people, as children are born, and you're in a foreign custom, you may preserve certain traditions, but remember, there was no law yet. There were no religious practices. So the first inkling we get of some God's reaching out to recovenant, if you will, is the Passover. Now, people would like to say, well, the Passover is that first time. No. The Passover marks one simple moment in time. You either trusted and listened to God or you didn't. Period. Nothing in between. If you didn't, you were dead, and if you did, you lived. And maybe amongst the people, there might have been some tale they told. Oh, back there many generations ago, we were told this was going to happen. We were also told we'd be let out with great riches. But beyond that, you tell me, other than animal sacrifice, which was being practiced, what could constitute Judaism while they were in Egypt's bondage, because Judaism did not exist. Okay? I'm sorry, this may be like, for some people, like, oh, no, I can't handle this. Well, then, I'm sorry, you need to read and appreciate the fact that I'm not just going along with what I call the usurpation of things, because it is, in a sense, history that has been usurped by people who'd like to claim something. We all have a claim to it, though. That's the problem. It's not for one group to claim, and I'm going to show you why. We can say all the people that come after Eber are all Hebrews. Both lines, the Arabs and what will ultimately become the Semitic line, they're all Hebrews. So while they were in Egypt's bondage, they were Hebrews. That's a right identification. Now you have another dilemma, though, and let me explain this one, because this one becomes the complexity. You have to look at a people called Canaanites. This will become highly problematic, because even people who are in archaeology or people who study the study of language and the development of language will tell you something. It's crystal clear. The first language we encounter, if we're digging in an archaeological frame of reference, is not Hebrew, it's Proto-Canaanite. That does not lie. You've got enough information to tell us these people, the Bible helps us, and then we've got archaeology to back it up. The Canaanites are not, by the way, one group. Let me just show you something. And it looks like he's a descendant, but no, he's part of this line here. So of the sons of Ham, it's Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan in that line. Then you look down and you see all these people: Sidon, Heth, Jebusite, Amorite, Girgashite, Hivite. So the Ite part, when you're reading Ite, that simply means son of. It's like the Irish saying O Mac is son of. Ite, son of. And if you read it in the Hebrew, it's Im. So you'd have, for example, Kenanim maybe. That's probably not correct, but it will end in Im. That's plural, suggesting the clan. Okay? So we're looking at both people who will also be identified by land. Make no mistake about that. Just like in Abraham's lineage, we have Haran as one of the relatives. That's also a place. These become places. So I just showed you Canaan is a descendant of Ham. And what's really important is you've got to look at the whole thing. You've got Canaan, who is cursed because of something that, by the way, you can say, well, he had nothing to do with. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But he didn't. From Ham's line, in other words, whatever Ham did that was terribly wrong, it fell on Canaan. And Canaan becomes cursed, and God says, and Canaan essentially will be a servant of servants. But you can't make any argument until you understand who was in the land. Who does the land belong to? And here comes the debate. I'm in antiquity. I'm not in modern times right now. I'm in antiquity. God makes a promise to Abram, and he says, and I'm going to give you land. I'm going to show you the land. And he's, if you remember, look up. Look as far as the eye can see, to the east, to the west, this is the land I give you, and he describes the land. But nowhere in Scripture will you find an exact measurement or exact pinpoint structure of what the land was. It's given in several different times, in several different ways. It seems like at one point it's described as a small swath, at other times it's described as a whole lot of land that maybe goes from Egypt all the way across. It is hard to understand at best, but we're talking about a general area. And God gives this promise to Abram for his descendants, but there are people living in that land. And it is Canaan, named after Canaan, the person, and all the descendants. If you look this up, and I'm telling you, look up anything I'm saying, I have no problem with it. Before Jerusalem was called Jerusalem, it was called the city of Jebus. Why? Because the Jebusites founded that city. And it very clearly says that David, later on, I know I've jumped all over the place, but David in about 1005 BC claims that city and makes that the city of David. Prior to that, it was called Jebus. That means the Jebusites lived there. And you can go through this whole list of people and find them. In fact, in one of the promises given to Abraham, he talks about how the iniquity of the Amorite has not yet been fulfilled. So it's as though God was saying, I'm going to give you this land for your seed, but what's not said under there is there are people who are living there. And don't just think about people in the sense of they're moving and they're traveling. There were established, archaeology shows us there were established people living there. See, a big change happened with the change in ages, if you will, where tools now are being made. People are actually wanting to stay in one place to farm, to live, to bring up a family. They're no longer wandering. So there were people living in that land, and those people will stay in that land. Okay, stop that story right there, and let's jump back into Bible history or Bible timeline. Moses is given the charge to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt's bondage. He does so, and by the way, that date is all over the map, but I'm a believer that most people have the date wrong. He leads the children of Israel out of Egypt's bondage because of their rebellion, and they start out right out the gate complaining, and everything's a problem. They wander for 40 years in the wilderness. Moses didn't make it in. God let him look on the promised land, but because of his disobedience in striking the rock instead of speaking to the rock, God lets him look on the land, and he also says it's a very small percentage of the original folks that are going to make it in. It says he strewed their bones in the wilderness because of their rebellion, their disobedience. And it's a handful of the first and second generation, and then their children going into the land. One of those is a name everyone should know, Caleb, an elderly man that comes from the tribe of Judah, and his story is chronicled there. But to make a long story short, after the death of Moses, his successor Joshua is appointed to lead these into the land. And when they are finally, after a couple of different problems that arise, when they are finally given land allotments, you have something very interesting that happens. And I've gone over this with you all already, but let's take a look at it so you can see it for yourself. And then you tell me if you think that these people did what God told them to do. So in Joshua, we have the record. And if you read Joshua, there'll be the land allotment to each tribe except for the Levites. They don't get land. Their inheritance is in the Lord. And God will make sure that they're housed pretty much along with the tribe eventually of Judah, the southern tribe as it will become. And here we end up with some interesting stuff. Joshua 15:63 says, for example, I'm just giving you this as an example. As for the Jebusite, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. Now we have every tribe that was supposed to drive out the enemy. Now let me describe this. This also becomes important because you would not have this interpretation or understand. People say, well, it's cruel. God said to go in there and drive them out, kill them, flush them out. Because they represented sin. They were idol worshiping. They were, some of them, of the most perverse and degenerate kind. I want you to think of this in many ways as a proto-evangel type idea. The people are going to go into the land and they're going to basically rid the land of sin, idolatry, and all the bad stuff that comes with it. The only problem is they didn't do it. Now, a couple of these tribes, it clearly says they took wives of these other peoples. Sorry. So, all of these folks that are living in the land, we just read about the Jebusite by Judah. You think that they didn't commingle? You think they didn't commingle if you think that you're crazy. Not all of them, but they commingled. The whole idea was God wanted to keep this group of people singled out. And he tells them over and over again, don't worship idols and don't mingle with other people. But they did. So now I'm going to ask the question, how can, if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, in the first place, which is rid the land of the people and of the sin. If you didn't do what you were supposed to do, and we know that they didn't do it, and what is the unfolding history after this? So we have a period where the people are going to be governed by judges, and ultimately they beg God for a king. And God gives them one in Saul. First Saul, then David, then Solomon. Part of the problem is, I'm describing a history of the people unfolding. Where does Judaism fit in here? Now, I prefer to identify some of the early worship practices and prescriptions as Yahwism only because I do not think that they worshipped one God. We have a chronicle of them speaking about God and to God and with God, but we have abundant archaeological proof that these were not clearly monotheistic people up until a certain point. And that point, even when the law is given to say, thou shalt have no other gods, they still go and they do. And the golden calf is just one of many incidences recorded in the Bible where they choose to put up idols and worship idols rather than God. So don't yell at the messenger here. I'm just telling you how it is. Now, you've got a people who have now commingled themselves. That means that the DNA is going to be crossed. And this is why when you step into the modern world and you start DNA testing, you've got a big problem, a huge problem. Do you know why? Because DNA is like this. 99% of human DNA is basically all the same. It's the 1% that is the identifier that breaks down into haplogroups. Without getting too technical and losing everybody on this, if you analyze, which has been done, bones found in antiquity to get the DNA, and then they took a group of, I believe it was 1,300 individuals living in the land who identify as both Arab and Jew, and you'd be surprised at what the DNA comes back with. It's like being cousins or brothers in the DNA. It's that close. Would it surprise you? Because they commingled. Would it surprise you that we also can know, so by virtue of what I just said, when they went into the land, they mixed with Canaanites. And the Canaanites descend all of these 12, I believe it's 12 or 13 tribes descending from Canaan. I'm not saying they all commingled and that they all had children and whatever else they did, but some of them did, which means the lines are already gotten muddled here. And no one wants to talk about that. But this is why when we do DNA testing, the DNA testing shows something so mind-blowing that I hate to say this, it's almost like if people could understand what is going on, it almost would make you cringe. It's like, we talk about so many people removed. You can be in a room and probably you might be related to somebody in the room by degrees, right? You've heard of that, right? This is on an infinitely closer level. We're not talking about 3 degrees removed. We're talking about a percentage in haplogroups that's so close together that we can see shared blood. Surprise! So, all I'm going to tell you is, when we talk about land, for example, you tell me, and it's a rhetorical question, so it's not an opinion, it's just something for you to think about. If, at the coming of Christ, everybody would say Jesus was a Jew, and he was, and many of his followers were. The coming of Christ was a time in history where God was showing, this is going to be my new covenant. There have been several covenants along the way. This is going to be the last one, the new and the last one, through Christ. And that should have been the signal enough. But it says, I've repeated this many times, you should know this by heart, he came to his own received him not. And then look at the dialogue exchanges that he has with the religious people. He doesn't say, you, my brethren. He speaks of, for example, he says, your feast, or your father the devil. He no longer is speaking like we're brothers here, because they rejected him. And that moment in time is a defining moment for Judaism. And let me tell you why. From the time they were carried away in captivity, the first captivity that occurred in 720-something BC, and that would be the northern kingdom, to the time of the carrying away of the southern kingdom, because the kingdoms divided at the death of Solomon around 930 or so BC. The carrying away of the southern kingdom, which included Judah, and eventually what will be called Judea, and ultimately those who lived there will be called Judahites, representing Judaism, not necessarily a clan. If you take that history right there, and that's history, that's not just simply limited to the Bible, because the Assyrian records and the Babylonian records record these events, as well as other peoples in the area. And you start to really analyze something, it becomes abundantly clear. One, when we talk about all of the tribes, the land was promised to all the tribes, not just one tribe. And the fact that the north was carried away by the Assyrians, they kept migrating, they kept going. Some of them, a couple of stragglers came back, but for the most part, they migrated. I covered this in the teaching on the lost tribes. Then you've got the southern portion. They get deported into Babylon, which was foretold in the Bible for 70 years. They come back. You tell me that they were Jews in bondage for 70 years, because when they come back, they don't even know their tongue and they can't even read. They hadn't even heard the law being read. It was Huldah. The book is brought out. Read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and you'll see, well, these people, the few that came back to rebuild the temple, they hadn't heard the law read. So you tell me what they were practicing while they were in Babylonian captivity. Do you have an answer? Because they weren't. They may have had some customs, but they weren't. And in fact, if you want to get to the core of all this, if a fragment of those people from the southern kingdom came back, let's just say less than 50,000 to rebuild, and eventually those people will be expulsed. Their relatives, their descendants eventually will be expulsed. By 70 AD, we will have an expulsion of the Jews from the Holy Land. Now you watch what happens to the land. Okay? 63 BC, the Romans take it. The expulsion happens in the fall of Jerusalem in 70. 313 to 636, there's a Byzantine occupation of the land. 636 to 1099, the Arabs occupy that land called the Holy Land, the whole Holy Land. 1099 to 1291, the Crusaders, 1291 to 1516. Mamluk, from 1517 to 1917, it is the Ottoman Empire. And subsequent to that, from 1917 or 18 to the finished completion of the Balfour Declaration, it's under British occupation. Let me ask you a question. If God be for us, who can be against us? Don't you think if God wanted the people to have back the land, he would have given them the power that he gave them early on to tell them to go into the land and rid the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, go in there and rid them? Is that not the same God? The problem we have, though, is this. When we talk about the complexity of a modern problem, you've got to peel back the layers enough and be an honest reporter, honest with yourself, honest before God, honest with this book, to properly analyze. I am not bashing Jewish people. We've got a lot of Jewish listeners. But I'm not going to have somebody tell me, oh, my history goes back that far, when in fact, the first mention I showed you is not even a mention of Jews in 2 Kings. It's Judahites. It's the men of Judah. And where we start encountering Jewish as a religion being practiced, post-exile, post-Babylon. So after they come back from the Babylonian captivity, and all you've got to do is open up the book of Esther, and Esther will kind of fill in the blanks there. So here's what's interesting. It starts to become clear that there is a progression. Don't think for a minute that all of the animal sacrifices represent Judaism and can be put under the banner of Judaism. Why? Because pagan societies offered animals, and our Lord and Savior died, spilling his blood. So you can't say, well, that was a prescription for Judaism. And then we come back to what makes a Jew a Jew. So there's a lot to peel back here, but the one thing that we know is that after the captivity, when they come back, they're trying to establish, and things are being added on, just like I've explained in the Catholic Church, and all these add-ons start to have these add-ons. And that the Judaism that's practiced today, do not think that it is as old as people want to tell you it is. The oldest practiced religion on the face of the earth is Hinduism. That's a fact. That's just a fact. You can be mad at me for that, but that just is what it is. And if you kind of know where that came out of, it would make a lot of sense. I'm not going to get into that. I don't have time. What I'm going to tell you is we have a collection of people that at the core of everything, when I hear my Jewish friends say, but we are the chosen people, they're leaving one thing out. Yeah, they're chosen, but so weren't all the rest of the tribes. The tribes of the children of Israel, if you take the kingdoms as they separated, as they got split up, the northern tribes, Samaria, they all disappear, but they were still chosen people. That means that amongst us in this church right here, I could have a descendant of those who were called chosen, not Jewish. See, it's actually dishonest to make it about one singular tribe and one singular people, when in fact God, when he said to Abraham, I will, high father, Abram changed his name to Abraham, father of many nations, high father, father of many nations. And many nations did come out of him, including, if you look at what I've done in the teaching on the lost tribes, you can see that all these people that migrated from the north, they were part of the chosen people who became probably the French, the Irish. I've isolated them in each of these lost tribe messages. So how can one group claim that they're chosen? And this begins this big kind of circular discussion which never has an end, because no one will ever have the guts to say what I'm saying. Being chosen by God in the children of Israel, there was more than the tribe of Judah, and Judah did not come out of the gate, Judah the child, as a Jew, all right? This is progression over time. So we can talk about the Hebrews, the Hebrew children, that's accurate. We can talk about, at some point after Jacob, all the descendants of Jacob can be referred to as Israelites, that's a fact. But not all Israel, even Paul says this, not all Israel is Jewish. Get that straight. This is what's driving me crazy as a person who studies and digs. You can't do that. It belongs to all the tribes, all who settled there. Why do you think? Gosh, while I'm at it, I'm going to make lots of friends here. But why do you think in the book of Revelation, when it talks about the church in Pergamos, and it says, I know thy works where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is, and he talks about the synagogue of Satan. That's in 2:9. Here, I know thy works, wrong church, Smyrna. I know thy works in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. What do you think that means? Now, I'm not trying to I don't want anyone to think for a minute I'm spreading hatred. I am the furthest away from that. In fact, I'm trying to show people that if we realize how close we are, what separates us? I'll tell you what separates us, Christ. Christ brings us as a body together and separates us from other people. What did Christ say? I came not to bring peace, but a sword. Think of all the things that you can combine into this concept and recognize that maybe we're just part of the problem. We just homogenize things and we just go with it because this should be of interest to us. Somebody remarked in the comments, well, I'm confused, Pastor. You say you're concerned with biblical Israel, but you talk about modern Israel in a different way. That's right. And it's so complicated to explain, but I'll try in about 2 minutes and see if I can do it. I don't think so. God still had to have a remnant of believing Jews in this day and age. Do you know why? To fulfill prophecy. See, that's why Judaism was not eradicated at the coming of Christ. The Old Testament, not the New, says in the book of Zechariah, they will look upon him whom they've pierced and they will mourn. That's speaking of the Jewish people. They will see Christ and they will mourn. If everybody just became a Christian, that scripture could not be fulfilled. Then you have the 144 preachers of righteousness. If we take all of these different parts and components, a tabernacle that must be built, which could only really technically be built by these people who are still adherents to Judaism. We actually need them to maintain their religion and their quasi-practices. They're not offering animal sacrifices anymore, but whatever they're doing, we need them to be maintained, as I said, as a bookmarker on the land and as a people to be able to fulfill what is yet to happen. So when somebody says, well, why didn't they all convert? There's a reason why. God's no dummy. God said there's a remnant here that has to stay within Judaism for this book to actually be fulfilled, for the things that I have prophesied through my prophets to come to pass, to come to fruition. So when we talk about this, and I've said it, and it's very, very clear, even through the tabernacle, I taught through the tabernacle, it all points to Christ. So if you're looking at the tabernacle, God didn't just come up with an idea to let's build this movable tent and let's just do some animal sacrifices. There was purpose and intent, really, to reveal Christ to a people who would not ever probably receive him. So if we understand this, there's a complex underbelly to what's going on today, and too much homogenization of terms. When people say, oh, they're all the Jewish people. Do you even know what you're talking about? Or the categories of people within Judaism, just like within Christianity, we have groups of people within Christendom. I'm just asking my listening audience, this is more of a message, food for thought, because when we come back next week, I'm going to lay out a very clear line. This was a little bit of throwing a lot of stuff at you. I'm going to lay out a very clear line, and we're going to see if we can start identifying points within the Hebrew Old Testament that will show us things that we can then glean and take away and say this is really the core or the heart of Judaism, and not maybe what we've all kind of thought, well, the tabernacle in the wilderness, oh, that's a Jewish thing. No, it's not. And I hate to tell you this, but even every exchange that God has with Moses, what does he say to Moses? Moses, all the prescriptions I've given you are Judaism. You know what he said to him? He said, I, the Lord your God, have told you this. And quite clearly, there is never a mention of God identifying himself only this way. I am who I am. That's how he identified himself. That's the name he gave. Yahweh, Elohim. So when we talk about evolution of things, it's really actually important for us to understand that our Jewish friends and their customs and traditions don't go as far back as we think. And today's Judaism may celebrate feasts like the Feast of Tabernacles, where they go outside in booths, but it resembles only that, the structure and the customs of that. Are they sacrificing animals? No. Are they practicing the practices of how many offerings they should give? No. So what did God say about keeping the law? You keep it all and you live. You miss one jot or tittle and you die. So I think it's a really good time to try and clean up and clarify, at least for my listening audience. I may not reach the rest of the world, and that's okay with me. But if I can reach the people that are listening to me, and you'll come in conversations with people, in contact with people who are opinionated but don't have this information. You'll come in contact with people who have either been steeped in traditions, and by the way, this is one of them, to assume that this religion has been around that long, when in fact, again, I read to you the starting point says they were practicing this long ago. No, they weren't. And what they were, the beginning of a covenant relationship, which started with Noah, went on to Abraham with a little bit more depth, that becomes, we'll say, brought into fruition at the time of Jacob's having all of his children and having his name changed to Israel. And from then on, we see a problem, perpetual. That is, no one will keep God's covenant, not even the very elite. And the very few that did, if they did it, they weren't able to keep it all fully. That's impossible. So my point in my summary here is to say, if we're really honest, we're going to find out that as an evolution, if you will, of a belief system takes place, we also need to understand there's a bigger message here, and it's not about who's a Jew and who's a Christian. It's God's repeated attempt through the streams of time to reach down and save a people, and not just a singular nation or a singular populace. Because he looked at his creation, and it says it grieved him at the core. What grieved him? That they had fallen so low that evil was in the heart of man's mind. This is not what God wanted. This is not God's design, but here we are with free will and all. And for the people who say free will don't exist, knock yourself out. But for those of us who are following and trying to sort this out, it becomes abundantly clear there is a lot of stuff to sort out, and hopefully if you're back here next week, that's what we'll do together. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.